I'm sure if everyone had a chance to create the perfect school, there would be lots of creative ideas on how an education system could work. Now that I think about it, maybe we should try that, because the current system definitely does not work for everyone. I find it wild to think that people were convinced one system could work for all, or that it should. A world of industry and machinery on the rise. Many moons have passed since then, and the world has evolved even more. In an article on the future of technology, William Chesidor explained we don't live in the world of Horace Mann or our grandparents anymore. The period from the 1830s to 1980s was static in value to the good enough mindset, and these days, good enough isn't good enough anymore. My wicked problem in education is attendance rates for Indigenous students. The articles I found related to high schools, however, I see challenges from this in younger grades as well. If the issues aren't addressed, the challenge to re enter school becomes harder the longer students are away. Although attendance is one element, there are multiple factors that contribute toward low attendance rates of Indigenous learners. This issue is important to educators because there is a high Indigenous population in Canada, especially in BC and on Vancouver Island. The articles I reviewed were of case studies done in different locations across Canada and involved different types of interviewees, but they all focused on education for Indigenous students. The results were equal across the board that lack of culture, language, and relevance were main themes contributing to low participation. Each Board of Education is required to establish and maintain an Indigenous Education Council to support equitable education and services for Indigenous students. However, it's still within a colonial template. First Nation, Inuit, and Métis all have their own cultures, and students who live on reserve and off reserve also experience different challenges as each other. Yet many Indigenous students have faced and continue to face the same conflicts with mainstream education. There is no blanket answer to solve all the problems. However, efforts need to be made to create positive change. The research in Nunavut reported that the community views the education system as a form of assimilation and imperialism. Being able to learn things that will help them with the subsistence lifestyle is what they need. In remote communities, the turnover rate of staff can be incredibly high, a lot of times incentivized by the government or agencies to move for short periods. Lessons that have been designed for the community over the years become lost in the mix as new teachers move in and start over time and time again. In 1972, the goal of the National Indian Brotherhood was to create more Indigenous teachers, requesting to waive rigid teaching requirements to enable Indian people who are fluent in Indian languages to become full-fledged teachers. Over 50 years later, we may be further away from having more fluent speakers as teachers. However, there are more Indigenous educators than ever before. And finally, the vision of non-Indigenous, being ready to recognize the value of another way of life, is here. Incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into the classroom is more in line with mainstream society than ever before. The study in an urban school in Saskatchewan believes that the 21st century pedagogy includes many similarities to the style of teaching that works for Indigenous learners. Locally, educators express the importance of the adults in students' lives. Families, Indigenous support workers, and youth mentors have a strong influence on a young learner's sense of belonging. A perfect class would include outdoor education, where cultural events are woven into the programming. The education system has evolved in recent years, though. Thanks to the work being done by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's been an increase in awareness of Indigenous knowledge. Unlike older generations, today's students are learning about the history of colonization at school. Provinces across Canada are working to offer Indigenous education courses in high schools, and in BC, it's now mandatory for every student to obtain credits in order to graduate. As a teen, I used to daydream about what life would be like if colonization didn't happen, or if it happened in reverse. A friend's dad says that his grandchildren are his grandparents' wildest dreams because they get culture and language every day at school. Imagine that, opposite to residential school, where Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their homes to learn a different way of life. Students can now go to school to learn their culture, and education is viewed as a good thing. What a concept. There are currently over 500 schools on reserve across Canada, and schools that focus on Indigenous ways are growing, each enriched with their own unique pedagogies throughout. There is a growing understanding that everyone can benefit from a more holistic approach. Every educator can learn different ways of teaching. It takes time, but as history has proven, we can make a difference on generations to come. Haichka, miigwech.